Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our edition of the current state of the climate. It is 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, the 16th of January in the year 2022. You are here with me, Garen Avaloki Teshvara, live in the Action for Climate Mitigation group. Hello, hello, hello. So if this is your first time, welcome to our kitchen. We're going to be switching to the presentation mode here right away, so that'll be a little more helpful. Just a little disclaimer, the fresh peanut butter cookies are not for you, they're for me. In the Awakening Consciousness group that I run, where I do the majority of my videos, and I have well over 1,000 videos in total, it's very common for me to extend my love to each and every one of you. And I'm going to do so right here and now as well. And the reason being is we're all in this together. And we really do have to focus on caring for each other and recognizing that we are all in this together. Not just our families, not just our neighbors, but the people living in every country in the world, the whole of humanity. So with that, we're going to switch into this presentation mode, and I hope this is going to work out well. I've spent a fair bit of time with this, and you'll bear with me as I magically shrink myself into the corner here. And we're going to carry on right away with the current state of the climate presentation. So again, my name is Garen Avaloki Teshvara, and it is Sunday the 16th in the year 2022, and it is 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and let's begin. So the first thing we need to understand is what tipping points are, and I have this great graphic to illustrate a tipping point. and it's more suited than a lot would realize, I think. So what is a tipping point? A tipping point is the point at which small changes become significant enough to cause a larger, more critical change that can be abrupt, irreversible, and lead to cascading effects, like dominoes falling over. The concept of tipping points was introduced by the International Panel for Climate Change 20 years ago. But then it was thought that that would only occur if global warming were to reach 5 degrees. We now know, of course, based on assessments and real-world observations, that those tipping points have become active in some cases already, and a lot of them are on the tipping point of tipping. So one of the ways we can really understand a tipping point is a kayak. So if you've ever sat in a kayak, and I'm speaking of, well, pretty much any style of kayak, if you try to lean over a little bit and you're paying attention, you'll notice that the kayak is resisting going over. But if you keep leaning over, get mesmerized by a little fish under the water and lean further and further over, there's a point where you don't have to lean anymore. The kayak does the rest of the work and flips over in the water. So the stable state of the kayak on top of the water facing upright all of a sudden hits a new stable state. And that state, of course, is upside down on the water, with you currently sucking in the water through your mouth, where your breath would normally be. So that's a very good example of what happens with a tipping point. Now here's the other interesting thing. Tipping points really fall into two categories. Ones we can do something about, reversible tipping points, and ones that we cannot do anything about. Those are known as irreversible tipping points. Now, even the reversing tipping point, if you've ever been stuck with a sit-in kayak on open water and it's flipped over and you're out of the boat, it takes a lot of work to get back to that other stable state. And in the case of our climate, there's very few of the systems where that can actually work. So we're going to start with the jet stream and the atmospheric rivers. And I want to make this clear that we're going to have this overview, and then we're going to dive into all the responses that we need to be making at a personal level of being. And don't worry, I'm going to keep this to a reasonable length of time. So the jet stream and the atmospheric rivers. Now, there's been a lot of talk about this, and atmospheric rivers are a relatively new term for Canadians and people in BC especially. You may not have heard of that term before, but believe it or not, you actually have heard of it, you just weren't aware of it. So one of those atmospheric rivers that's well known worldwide is known as the Pineapple Express. This is an atmospheric river that usually dumps vast amounts of precipitation on California. But given the changes that have been going on with our world's climate, of course, those atmospheric rivers are now reaching further and further north, right to the pole. So if we were to look at this picture here, we can see that if we have a strong jet stream, that we have a stable polar vortex. And this strong jet stream, even in the summertime, acts as sort of a protective shroud for the north mid-latitudes and provides a cooling effect. Because keep in mind, we actually have a huge amount of sunlight pouring down upon us. And what happens when the jet stream weakens and the polar vortex starts to wave is we get meandering. And in between these meanderings, we can get these troughs and waves of warm air that push further north. And we're going to detail a little bit about that in a very interesting web-based program that you can access, anyone in the public can access, and I want to show that to you as well. So the change in warming at higher latitudes and reducing the temperature difference between the warmer mid-latitude and polar regions. This weakens and destabilizes the polar jet stream, causing it to dip into lower latitudes, bringing polar air further south. And if you're not aware, right now, the southern United States over on the East Coast is getting obliterated by snowstorms. Waves in the jet stream can also make extreme weather events worse, causing storms and heat waves to move more slowly or get stuck in place, as we experienced right here in BC during the 2021 heat waves. The piece of software that I want to show you, and I'm going to show it to you right away, is a web-based piece of software. And this is known as earth.nullschool.net. And you can write that down or find it here in the video or in one of the posts. And right here you can see that I'm looking at air currents, or air currents actually, at the surface, and I've overlaid temperature on it. So this is a very good indication. You can actually see the whole world here. And if we're looking right here, so this is Vancouver Island, we can see right here. And if you were to click on any spot, this is the air temperature and the wind speed right at the spot that you've clicked on it. And it's very interesting because we can see the patterns of air movement. So in order to take a look at the jet stream, what we need to do is we got to get to the right height. Now the jet stream usually hangs out in the 32,000 to 39,000 feet, which would be roughly around 250 hectopascals. So if we were to look at the air and wind with an overlay of temperature, we can get a good indication here, and we can actually see how this cold air, you see this piece of cold air here, that's what's moving in through and hammering the US right now, and it's sitting right alongside some warmer air, and that's of course why you get this massive amounts of precipitation. We can also see a cold spot out here that's registering as minus 55. Keep in mind that that's at an altitude of roughly 32 to 39,000 feet. So this can be a fantastic tool that you can use to take a look at and get a handle for yourself what's actually going on. So we're going to go back to the presentation. The next tipping point we need to talk about is the Greenland ice sheet. And the interesting thing about this tipping point is that it's all based on altitude, on elevation. So the Greenland ice sheet is roughly 3,000 meters thick. That's 3 kilometers. And keep in mind that the vast majority of it sits on bedrock. So that's 3,000 feet of ice above ground. That ice reaches a high elevation. It's like going up into the mountains. And the air up there is much cooler. But as the Greenland ice sheet is melting away faster and faster and faster, it's starting to head towards a critical altitude point where if it falls below that altitude, there will be never a chance of recovering the ice sheet because the air at that altitude is simply too warm. Snow will no longer form, and we've already seen rain on the Greenland ice sheet. So there's grave concern that this tipping point's actually already been crossed. The ice sheet itself contains enough water to raise global sea levels by over 20 feet, and its melting is accelerating. From 1992 to 2018, it lost close to 4 trillion tons of ice. The Greenland ice sheet loses so much ice in that time period that it's actually made changes to the Earth's gravitational field. And as a matter of fact, the GRACE satellite system uses those changes in the gravitational field to get a handle on ice thickness and how much ice is actually melting away. A new study found that ice sheet height and melting rates in the Jakobshavn Basin, one of the fastest melting basins in Greenland, are destabilizing the ice sheet. Most of the melting occurs on the ice surface because of warming temperatures, but as the height of the ice sheet is reduced, the surface is exposed to warmer air at lower altitudes, which feeds back on itself in a positive feedback loop, which is not a good thing, and reinforces that melting. That's why it's a positive feedback loop. In addition, the ice is darker, and that allows it to absorb more of the sun's rays and warms faster yet again. We also have an issue with increased bacteria activity within the ice, and we're going to talk about that as well. So understanding why this is so important, you need to know one of these funky little terms that is used in science, especially in climate science, and that is albedo. And albedo can be thought of, well, if we look at this picture, anything with an albedo approaching 1 is considered high albedo. And clean, clear, freshly snowed over ice is very close to 1. It reflects almost all of the incoming solar radiation right back off into space. But anything less than that is absorbing part of that solar radiation. And of course, when it comes to open water is very dark. And that absorbs vast amounts. Almost all of the solar radiation is absorbed. Algae growth accelerating also creates a darkening effect on the ice sheet. So as the ice is melting, more and more biological material that's been trapped in the ice is now warmed up to the point where molds, fungus, and bacteria begin to grow. And those colonies themselves reach a certain size and begin to generate their own heat and continue to melt the ice ever faster and faster. So here on the Earth, the albedo has a very critical impact on our climate. And this is why, one of the reasons why we've enjoyed such a balanced climatic system for so long. We've had a lot of reflectivity off of both the poles. If we were to look at Antarctica, for example, you could take the entirety of the United States and it would fit inside of Antarctica. It would all sit on the ice. So that's how large that reflective mirror is. The one on the North Pole is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. An example of this albedo effect is the snow temperature feedback. So, you know, if you've ever gone skiing, for example, and it's really bright out, you have to have sunscreen on because even though the air is cold, because most of that heat energy is being reflected right back off into space, that reflection of that radiation will burn you to a crisp, as anyone who's done it has known. And the same thing happens a lot of times when you're on open water in the lake. You're still getting that reflection of light, although it's reflecting very little of the actual radiation, but it's enough still to burn your skin from the bottom up. The more open ground, the more open water you have, the more the increase in temperature, both in the water, on the ground, and in the air in the surrounding area. Another one of the big tipping points is the West Antarctic Ice Sheet, or WAIS, and this has been in the news recently. The recent research shows that the Thwaites Glacier will likely go about a full collapse within the next 5 years. So this picture here is a good indication of what's actually going on. So what happens is this warm circumpolar deep water flows are hammering at the ice shelf here. And this glacial marine muds, known as till, acts like a grinder. And as this melting is occurring, it's destabilizing these front edges and icebergs begin to calve off. Crevices form where the pressure's building up on the ice, and you run the risk of losing the entire ice shelf. Now, luckily, a large part of Thwaites is already floating, so that the Thwaites itself falling off and melting is not going to raise the sea level a huge amount. But over the course of a couple years, the ice that is sitting back in the till, actually grounded in the bedrock and in that glacial marine mud, will be directly affecting sea level and could account for an additional couple feet. So a 2018 study found that the WAIS went from 58.5 billion tons a year between 92 and 97 to 175 billion tons from 2012 to 2017. So a 5-year time period with almost three times as much melt. The glacier, the Thwaites Glacier on the West Arctic Amundsen Sea has lost 1 trillion tons of ice since the early 2000s. And this is one of those cases where if it tips over, there's no way to tip the kayak back over. We're never going to get that ice back again. One of the other big tipping points, now granted, this tipping point is having an effect on our climate, but it probably is not likely to fail within my lifetime, is the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. Now, this is a planetary-wide current that operates on timescales measured in 1,000 years. It is one of the main global ocean currents and is critical to regulating climate. Cold, salty water, which is dense and heavy, sinks deep into the ocean in the North Atlantic. And, we can see that up in here. And it moves along the bottom in miles deep water and flows slowly over the course of upwards of 1,000 years to create a full, circular navigation path. And rises to the surface near the equator, usually in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, in this area here. Heat from the sun then warms this water, and evaporation leaves the water saltier. The warm, salty water travels up the coast via the Gulf Stream, warming the U.S. coast and Western Europe. Once the water releases its heat and reaches the North Atlantic, it becomes cold and dense again, and the cycle continues. As glaciers and ice sheets melt, they add fresh, less dense water, which prevents the water from sinking and impedes circulation. We figure since 1950, based on observation, that the AMOC has slowed 15%. And a recent study has found that is its weakest state in 1,000 years. Now, why this is critical is if this were to actually shut off, believe it or not, the rest of the world would continue to heat, but parts of Europe would end up in a mini glacial age. The Amazon rainforest, this is another big one. The world's largest tropical rainforest, it stores 200 billion tons of carbon, equal to about 5 years of global carbon emissions from the burning of fossil fuels. It is also home to millions of species of plants and wildlife. Calling the Amazon the lungs of the world is really a little bit of a misnomer, because believe it or not, what the Amazon really is the warm, moist breath of the world. So through a process known as evapotranspiration, and you know what, I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'm going to get back to the text and then I'll carry on with that. So the moisture from the Amazon's rainfall returns to the atmosphere from the soil through evaporation and from the plants through transpiration. We term that evapotranspiration. This self-sustaining process creates clouds and more rainfall. So what normally happens in the Amazon is if you have a little bit of drought condition going on in the east, that drought condition extends all the way into the west and has effects on the west. The reason being is that the air is moving predominantly from east to west over the Amazon, and if there's not enough moisture being evapotranspirated out of the jungle, the rest of the jungle to the west of that eastern portion suffers. Because of logging, ranching, mining, agriculture, and fires, the Amazon has lost about 17% of its tree cover, and at the current rate of deforestation could reach a loss of 27% by 2030. If 20 to 25% of the Amazon were deforested, its tipping point would be crossed. Fewer trees would mean less evapotranspiration, and without enough rainfall to sustain itself, the Amazon could start to die back. In other words, parts of the rainforest could transition into a savanna, a drier ecosystem characterized by grasslands and few trees. In this process, it could potentially release 90 gigatons of CO2, which would definitely exacerbate climate change. It would also result in a huge loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services, affecting global weather patterns, and threaten the lives of some 30 million people, many of them First Nations who depend upon the rainforest to survive. As of 2020, large swaths of the rainforest that have been cut down and destroyed are now emitting carbon. One of the big concerns, and you can see the barest hint of it in this picture, but if you'll notice here, this is what's known as an emergent tree. So most of the younger trees are quite safe under the canopy of trees. They aren't as prone to being affected by drought. But in the Amazon, the trees that die first are the old trees, because they stand above the canopy, and we can see other examples here where we see trees that are actually above the canopy, and those trees are the older trees, and they're the ones that are going to die off first. The boreal forests. Not a lot of talk is made about the boreal forests, but realistically speaking, the boreal forests are far larger than the Amazon. They literally span the upper mid-latitudes and encircle the globe. Stretching from Yukon to Newfoundland and Labrador, the boreal forest makes up 55% of Canada's landmass. It is home to hundreds of indigenous communities, 300 bird species, and the iconic woodland caribou. That home is now at risk due to resource extraction, which is fracturing the land. Almost 3/4 of Canada's boreal woodland caribou herds are not self-sustaining, meaning they need rapid conservation intervention to survive. Fire, drought, insect migration due to climate change, oil and gas exploration, drilling, logging, and deforestation due to progress now threaten over 2/3 of our critical lungs. More than 70% of the woodland caribou are in decline. The ecosystems play a big part in it, but believe it or not, during the IPCC, ecosystems are not included. Permafrost. This is another big tipping point, and this again has to do with a lot of areas in Siberia, here in Canada again, and in Alaska. So permafrost is ground that has remained frozen for 2 or more consecutive years. Some permafrost has been frozen for tens of hundreds of thousands of years, in some cases even millions of years. It is found in Siberia, Alaska, northern Canada, and some of the steppes in Tibet. In the southern hemisphere, there is permafrost in parts of Patagonia, Antarctica, and the southern Alps of New Zealand. 1,400 billion tons of carbon are thought to be frozen in the Arctic's permafrost, which is twice as much carbon dioxide that is currently in the atmosphere. The risk of letting all that permafrost unthaw should be obvious at this point. The latest information says that the Arctic is actually warming 4.5 times as fast as the rest of the planet and has warmed nearly a full 5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. As it warms and thaws the permafrost, microbes come out of hibernation, break down the organic carbon in the soil, releasing CO2 and methane, which then trigger even more warming and melting. And this is an example here of a permafrost sink. And this is what is left over when all the permafrost has melted. You get this scarred surface. Now, one of the issues is methane and methane hydrates. So we do want to talk about methane as well, and this is also part of the tipping point system we have to worry about and part of climate change. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It is not near as potent as something like nitrous oxide, but it is over time roughly 20 times more effective per molecule than carbon dioxide is at retaining heat. And interestingly enough, when methane does break down, it breaks down into more carbon dioxide. An increased release from the ocean into the atmosphere could further intensify the greenhouse effect. Methane hydrates are essentially this crystalline ice structure around the actual gas molecule, and because of pressure and cold, it remains in a stable state. The methane that we really have to worry about is the methane that lies here in these areas, in the shallows and in the permafrost itself. Now, methane hydrates, when they're warmed sufficiently that the crystalline structure breaks and the gases can be released, the change in volume is an expansion of 16,000%, 160 times the volume. And this is what causes the methane bombs that leave those strange craters in Alaska and Siberia during the summer months. Now, the world methane averages are roughly 1,824 parts per million. They're measured on the Mauna Loa volcano, and they've been measured since 1959. In November, methane levels were recorded over 2,700 parts per billion. And in December, in excess of 3,000 parts per billion. So if we look on this little map here on the left, this is the METOP-B satellite. And any of the white swaths are where there was not sufficient data or the data could not be verified. So we leave those areas out. But here is the polar regions. And if we look at the polar regions, we can see that that's where those high methane levels are right now. A mean of 1883 across the planet, which is much higher than the 1824 norm. And again in November of last year in 2021, a full 3,027 parts per billion, nearly twice the global normal average. This is an indication that this tipping point has been reached and is slowly beginning to give away. This can sound a little depressing. I understand, I really do. I really invite you to stick with it, to take in this information, to learn where we really stand as a civilization, and then decide and choose what steps that you want to take. Known as the rainforest of the ocean, coral reefs cover less than 1% of the ocean, yet are home to and provide for 40% of life in the ocean. That is an unbelievable marvel of creation, that less than 1% is responsible for 40% of life. According to the Status of Coral Reefs of the World 2020 report, basically 14% were lost between 2009 and 2018. A 70 to 90% decrease in live coral on reefs by 2035 may occur without drastic action to limit global warming to 1.5 maximum. The loss of the coral reefs really represents the loss of the ocean. It truly does. This plays right into that same sort of thing, and one of the reasons the oceans are acidifying is that we're dumping more and more carbon dioxide in, and the ocean is the largest uptake of carbon dioxide on the planet. And what we've noticed from what the scientific papers and studies have shown is that uptake is actually beginning to slow down, which will only exacerbate our climate situation. So in this graphic here, we can see the massive dead zones that are now present full-time in our oceans around the planet. And this blue area is an open ocean dead zone that really starts off the coast of the States and all the way down into South America. We see the dead zone here in front of Alaska. These red areas are coastal dead zones, Upper Canada as well and into Alaska. We see these dead zones and these open ocean dead zones all over the planet. Now, what's happening in this area is that the water has been literally damaged, is the only way to say it, to such a point that there is no more oxygen left in the water to support life. So in these areas, we can get especially along the coastlines, this is where we get a lot of the red tide events and events where anaerobic bacteria and algae are able to grow, which don't need the oxygen. And that forms what's known as a red tide, which can poison and kill fish, animals, and people. 50% of the world's oxygen comes from the ocean. This is why such a thing is critical, and we really have to be aware of this. So now we're going to get right into the nitty-gritty of things. That really covers off the majority of the tipping points. We have one more tipping point to talk about that's not talked about by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the conundrum is this. CO2 emissions have risen right alongside global GDP and population. Keep in mind this is a 2011 graphic. The numbers are now higher. The curve is not so shallow. The curve has grown more straight up and down. Our CO2 emissions are over 40 billion tons a year. And the CO2 emissions, the GDP, and the population have literally grown alongside each other. Our way of life must change. There are no ways to keep these graphs going in the same direction. We can no longer continue in a capitalist economical system dependent on never-ending growth. Nothing in nature does that, except cancer. Modern civilization has never experienced this much amount of warming, ever. And this is an important point to wrap your head around. I don't care who gives you the concept that we have any knowledge as to whether or not humanity can survive in a warming world, because the answer is we don't. We have no knowledge. If we look here, the warmest multi-century period in more than 100,000 years was from 0.2 to 1 degree. We are now at 1.2 degrees. This warming has been unprecedented in more than 2,000 years, and that is the rate of warming. We did have a spike a couple of thousand years ago, a very strange spike actually, but that turned itself right around again because obviously the conditions weren't right for that to spike up, and there were some outside influences that were affecting that at the time, some geological influences. Right now, though, this is anthropomorphic. This is human-caused heating. The science is clear on that. So what this is really showing us is that in the last 10,000 years, that the large-scale agricultural development has occurred that's allowed civilization to begin to take off. And then with the development, the discovery of fossil fuels and the Industrial Revolution in the around 1850 or so, humanity has never actually experienced what we're going through right now. We've never experienced whether we can actually survive in these conditions. This is the first time in all of human history that we've been faced with a world that looks like this. And that is undeniable. Why be worried? A few notes. So, roughly every part per million rise corresponds to roughly 7.8 billion tons of carbon dioxide lingering in the atmosphere. What you're seeing here is all the various COPs that have gone on and all the assessment reports, and what the author's done here is drawn in the lines that says, okay, so if we had cottoned on in the 60s when we first started talking about climate change and took action then, we would be sitting at around 355 parts per million of carbon dioxide. If we'd waited till 1970, of course, that number rises closer to 380. So here's where we're sitting today. We're sitting here where we've passed through 420 parts per million. And despite all these COPs, what's happened? Carbon dioxide emissions are continuing to go up, and they're accelerating. In the 1960s, carbon dioxide concentrations were increasing at 0.77 parts per million a year. By the 2010s, they were 3 times faster at 2.37. This year, in the year 2020, which you think would have been fairly slow thanks to the pandemic, we are pegged at 2.7. The only decade in which there was essentially no acceleration in the levels of carbon dioxide over the previous decade was in the 90s due to the chaos which followed during the collapse of the Soviet Union. So honestly, we do need to have a level of concern. We really do. We are not in a normal period of human history. We are in a very abnormal period. We're actually more like a plague-like period. Arguably, this started in the 1800s, but the data says the real explosion began at the end of the Second World War. So what do we mean by this? Well, if we can assume that we can say there's been 10,000 years of modern man, and we're not talking, the 30,000-year-old people who were drawing in caves, we're talking 10,000 years of modern agricultural society-forming man. that began to conglomerate together in cities and communities and work together. During all that time, we stayed underneath the carrying capacity of the planet. And then at the end of the Second World War, somewhere right around this phase here, all the conditions were right for favorable growth. And just like in the animal kingdom, when all the conditions are right, a species will expand out into its environment. And that's exactly what humanity did. Driven by the advantages of fossil fuel, we have grown in number. The rate is astounding. It really is. And what's happened is we've ridden this boom all the way up, way past the carrying capacity of the planet. We crossed this carrying capacity somewhere back in the 1970s, where we began to take more out of the planet on a yearly basis than the planet could actually replace in that same year. We're currently sitting at about 1.7 Earth's worth per year. Now, here's the tough part. Scarcity, onset, and degrowth. These are things that people are terrified of, but this is the reality. We are now far into planetary overshoot, where given our lifestyle and the way we've been living, the planet hasn't been able to support us for nearly 50 years. And it's currently on life support, and that means we are as well. Here's a look at fuel use and population correlation. So you can see here in terms of thousands of years, okay, so here's the year 2000, here's the year 0, and going backwards to 10,000 years ago, basically our fuel use was next to nothing. And then here we go through this monumental spike, which is also representative of where we are with our population in terms of millions of billions of people. 7,000 million, 7 billion plus people on the planet. This is a thing that isn't taken into account by the COP reports, nor the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and that is the biodiversity in the ecosystems. So you want to know why we need to be concerned right now, and we're not talking about the effects of monoculture or soil integrity, but we are currently have experienced a 47% decline in ecosystem extent and condition. 25% of all species are at risk of extinction. Biotic integrity has declined by 23%. Biomass and species abundant has fallen by 82%. Nature for indigenous peoples and local communities, 72% of indicators developed by indigenous peoples and local communities show ongoing deterioration of elements of nature important to them. Clean water is a human need and a human right, yet is becoming harder and harder to access. As climate change worsens and populations increase, more regions are experiencing water scarcity. This is happening in California right now, and in various states that depend upon water from those areas. That simply isn't there anymore. The World Health Organization predicts that by 2025, that's 3 years from now, half the world's population will be living in water-stressed areas. And of that, over 2 billion will have water that's unhealthy to even drink. So I'm just gonna open my thing here just a little larger, I think, so I can be a little closer to the conversation, because this is where things get a little more serious. So ecological grief, climate depression, and eco-anxiety. If you're not experiencing these symptoms, there's something wrong with you. I'm sorry, but there is. You got to realize the seriousness of this, and I'm not saying that you should be hamstrung by these, but you are experiencing them at some level if you're a human being. We're attached to nature. Just like deer know to get out of an area before an earthquake, all of humanity is feeling this subtle little alarm bell in the pit of their stomach. If the thought of permanent changes to temperature, weather, and animal and human habitats alarms you, this is a perfectly reasonable fear. Maybe you, like many others, feel deeply traumatized by the harm already done to some natural environments and species. An increased sense of hopelessness about the planet's changes is just one of the ways eco-anxiety may show up. Other symptoms, and frustration is the one that I deal with the most, to be honest, especially towards people who don't acknowledge that it's actually happening or blaming it on my generation. Fatalistic thinking is another way, and that's really understandable. Existential dread, guilt or shame related to your own carbon footprint, your own past decisions. Post-traumatic stress after experiencing effects of climate change. There are tens of thousands of people right here in British Columbia alone who are suffering those effects still from the floods. And this is one of the concerns as disaster after disaster begin to pile up. Feelings of depression, anxiety, or panic, grief and sadness over the loss of natural environments. And I'm the worst for this. I'm out there in nature and I see something destroyed and it just brings me to tears. Obsessive thoughts about the climate? No, I'm not doing that, but that's understandable too. So who is most at risk in these situations? Well, the risk factors are numerous, but the people who are most at risk are the most vulnerable. Eco-anxiety can affect anyone. Certain groups, though, face a higher chance of climate-related distress, and that is because of their vulnerability. So Indigenous communities, people living in coastal or island regions, dry areas, or other regions with high geological risk. Socio-economically disadvantaged communities and people. Children and older adults. People living with disabilities and chronic health concerns. Plenty of complex factors contribute to increased risk. Families with lower annual income may have a harder time weathering the impact of a natural disaster. People with a lot of money and multiple homes, if they lose one home, they just move into another home. But if you're a young family with low income and you're struggling to survive and you lose your home, you may be on the streets. Currently, we do have systems in place, but the real question is how long can those systems possibly last in the face of an ever-growing climate casino? Of course, people living in communities where the climate is making real changes to their way of life, they are also at high risk. Suicide rates due to eco-anxiety are already on a rise across the planet. We've lost people here in BC at the end of the fire season who simply could not handle the devastation that had been wrought. These are very real things that we are going to need to be able to come to terms with. And there are things that you can do. Number one, don't bury your head in the sand. One of the things about life is life is here to teach us. And when we bury our head in the sand, life simply waits right there for us to come up for air. And when we do, that which we tried to deny, that which we tried to hide from, is there waiting for us. You can surround yourself with people who understand. Take affirmative, positive action, and we're going to talk about some of those actions as well. Educate yourself. Learn what's really going on. Once you really understand how much trouble we're truly in, you will see that most of what governments are doing right now is mostly just political talk. It's not actually going to do what needs to be done. Seek support from wherever you feel most comfortable, and don't forget and always prioritize self-care, which means loving yourself, looking after yourself. Even if you have others who you need to look after, caring for yourself and making that a priority gives you the energy and the ability to care for others. Don't beat yourself up. We are facing a real threat. And it seems distant, but it's not distant. It's happening right now. In this context, we can look at anxiety as perhaps actually working as intended right now, as a motivator for survival, a unique emotional response propelling humankind to seek out solutions. Instead of denying and pushing aside fear and grief, allow yourself to fully acknowledge these feelings. It's okay to weep for a race that the suffering is just beginning. It truly is. Have compassion for yourself. You're only one person. There's only so much you can do. Spend time on the beaches, in the mountains, on those trails. Love every minute of it. Why? Because nature, even with the damage she's already taken, will still heal you at every turn if you spend the time with her. You will also feel more at peace. And you will protect what you love. You truly will. The actions you can take, and we're going to have a little frank talk on the next slide here. You can write or telephone your local MP and MLA, the city councilors, the mayor, and copy it to your local newspapers and other news agencies where possible. Assess your home and property for flood, wind, and fire risk, including very heavy downbursts that may overwhelm drainage systems. Simplify your own life and begin to live in line with your values. Start growing your own food wherever possible. I've started a small in-home hydroponic system, very inexpensive. I've already got seeds. 3 days ago it came in, and I've already got seeds that are sprouting. I just can't wait. Take part in community gardens. Join gleaning groups to help feed you and your family more locally where possible. Stop unnecessary trips. Really think about when you're going to get in your car, why you're getting in your car, and if you can avoid it. Avoid air travel where unnecessary. Go after your local municipalities. Make sure there are designated safe shelters for loss of power times in winter, where thousands of people may be without power for 24 hours or more, as well as in heat waves. You have to deal with your local municipalities and get them on board now. Form support groups for the hard times that are marching this way. Form small little communities within your community. Work on building up a safe pantry, canning food, drying goods, beginning to take those sort of actions. Our best opportunities. I'm a realist, okay, and I have spent some decades with this at a personal level. I have also absorbed well over 1,000 peer-reviewed papers, done a lot of research on this, and I got to tell you, the human race is in for a wallop. It really is. There are some things we can do to ease the fall, but the fall is going to come. Marine cloud brightening appears to be one of the most cost-effective emergent technologies that may help mitigate warming before it becomes catastrophic. Where the marine cloud brightening may help is in the Arctic and in the Antarctic. And it's a simple matter of pumping water vapor into the air, which is more reflective, thereby increasing the albedo over open water and helping to keep a cooling effect into place. A planned phase out of fossil fuels has to happen immediately. Since the time of the last COP in November, people don't really understand that the data that the 2021 COP is all from like 2019 and 2020. So the 2021 data shows that we've actually increased again in our use of fossil fuels. We haven't dropped an ounce. We've actually bounced back from the first COVID dip that we had, and now we're using more than ever. We are not heading in the right direction. Under no circumstances are we going in the right way. Remove all investments from fossil fuel industries and invest in green technology, and demand from your government leaders that they do so as well. This is a biggie. Update building codes immediately and begin to build for the future. There's no way that humanity is going to survive in the houses they're living in. They're not designed for the climate changes that we have coming. They're not designed for the wind power. They're not designed for the prolonged heat. They're not designed for the prolonged precipitation. Return to eating locally as much as possible. This is a big one. Grow some of your own food. The day will come when you walk into a grocery store and due to drought or catastrophic event, the food you need will not be there. Be prepared. Given the extreme state of overshoot that we're in, the fact that as we sit today, the planet really only has enough resources to support 2 billion people living the lifestyle that we live here in North America, it doesn't look good for humanity. Roughly 90% of the world's biodiversity is due to die off. Current oil exploration and production are up again in the last 4 months since COP26, and our demand has skyrocketed. CO2 emissions are increasing commensurately. Billions are going to suffer. Be the change. I'm just going to expand myself back to where I belong in here. So that really is the conclusion of the video. I know it's a tough video to watch. I really do. And I do sympathize with anyone who's struggling with this. And believe me, I'm very afraid for your children and your grandchildren. I really am. There does not appear to be a way out of this in the way that civilization would like. You see, it's not enough to try and do things to mitigate carbon dioxide. It's not enough to do things to try and cool the atmosphere. We are using far too much of this planet, and that is growing year by year by year as the planet is literally dying underneath our feet. There will come a day very, very soon by 2030 where our civilizations will be in full collapse. I really don't see a way back from that. What we choose to do about that, how we choose to emerge from that, the people we choose to be during these times, that's what's going to determine the future of humanity. We have an opportunity right now to come together, to work together, to change our economy, to go with an eco-based economic system where the riches are measured in terms of how much the earth is healed. And believe me, I've experienced owning nothing, and you will be far happier owning less. Far happier. We live in a world that is changing faster and faster, and quite frankly, the future is about as dark as it gets. This is a time like no other in human history. We face an existential threat from which there is no reverse. There is no way out of this. There is only a way through it. This is why mitigation right now and working to create food sources within local communities and working with your local community and being part of your local community, growing your own food, these are the things that are going to be important. Teach your children to care for themselves. Teach them how to grow. Teach them how to fix, how to make things, how to think critically, and most importantly, instill within them a love for nature, the little of it that is truly left. It's a tough road forward. Personally, I will be here for anyone who needs until the day I die. Just get a hold of me. I never charge anything. I just want to help. You are loved. You are cared for. We will find a way through this. My concern, as always, is that I don't want to see the suffering. I don't want to see anyone have to suffer. over the way that we've chosen to live. The writing is on the wall. We have an opportunity here. There is a way through, a way that can offer a future for our children. It is not easy. It's going to be incredibly painful and difficult, but it is far less painful and far less difficult than continuing on the way we're doing today. That's it. That's all. Namaste to you. Have a beautiful night.